Good morning. My name is Steve Avery, and we're doing a webinar this morning on scanning aspects to government contracting. Specifically, we're looking at what are the government requirements, what are the practical requirements for going completely electronic on everything. A little bit of housekeeping. Again, later this afternoon, both the webinar and the slides will be available up on the website for you to look at. So go ahead. It's now its own web page with the past one, since this will be the second one. And you can just go ahead and get through that through DCAcompliance.com. All right, let's go ahead and begin with this. What we're going to talk about the issue itself, about scanning, and how the technology in DCAA figures into this. We're going to talk about what the real-world concerns are versus auditor illusions. About what I mean by that is what you really should be doing for that. You don't run your company the way the IRS wants you to run your company, because all they care about is whether you pay your taxes or not. You run your company to give you the information and to provide you with what you really need to get things done. Then we're going to talk about solutions and implementation. This will get you a little bit of feel about what we're going to do later in the policies and procedure workshop next month, and some of the ways that you go ahead and write up policies and procedures to address these issues so that it deals with both the real world and the auditor concerns. Well, recently both American Express and Citibank have been running commercials about this issue. So let's look at one. Okay, so that just sort of shows everything that that can go wrong with scanning processes. If that was a meal receipt, she needed to mark, like we talked about last week, meal entertainment, who was there, what the business purpose was, etc. And then she tossed it away, which, as we'll see later, is actually not allowed under the current federal regulations. But having said that, scanning offers businesses several advantages. One is obviously storage issues are a big aspect of this. You could actually reduce the amount of time looking for stuff and hopefully finding it when it's stored digitally. Accessibility again. It's easier to get to, hopefully, and not have to go through 65 crates in a shed to try and find something. And it's convenient. It's easy, it's maybe easier for people to scan and get stuff paid than it would be to turn stuff in and process it that way. But we're going to talk about, again, the requirements as far as keeping the originals go. All right, some of the disadvantages is that I have never seen an instance where somehow things still don't get lost. I've never been able to figure it out. You seem to be able to have the best system in the world, and always the one the DCAA asks for is the one electronic receipt you can't find. And DCAA's concerns about document integrity. We're going to talk about that a little bit also. Okay, so let's start with the technology. They're becoming the standard, ScanDoc. I have pretty much run my office paperless since 2008. My brother put together a paperless hospital years ago. Now, the challenge is, back in 1961, a science fiction author named Robert Heinlein envisioned a world where originals were impossible to prove. Any document, audio record, or even video record could be altered or fabricated. The word original lost all meaning. Contracts. How could a contract be binding if the original could be altered at any time and the record be changed? So how do you trust everything? So this is where we're getting today. We're getting to a point where the fabrication and the authenticity of documents can be questioned on almost any level. And that presents a really big challenge to what we're going through. So scanned documents, on the other hand, still offer enormous improvements in efficiency, and even if set up correctly, can cause improvements in accountability. if the systems surrounding the documents are implemented and maintained correctly. But DCAA is right to express concerns about these accountability issues. So here's an email I got from a DCAA supervisor back in July. And actually, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because actually she sort of rewrote the FAR. And to be dead honest with you, I think she actually made that a little bit clearer than the FAR actually did. Okay, so Steve, in order to accept scanned copies, we would need the contractor's established procedures as stated by the 3 criteria below. One is that it has to be accurate images to include signatures and written or graphic data. In other words, when you annotated on a meal ticket who was with you and what the business purpose was. You have to have an indexing system so that you can find it pretty easily. And you have to maintain the original records for 1 year after the imaging, which is sort of interesting from DCAA's perspective because I haven't seen them audit an incurred cost proposal in 1 year in a long, long time. So by the time they're going to ask for this stuff, all that should be around is the electronic copies. But what they may do then is they may go ahead and do a sample of your current expenses to see if the system has integrity. Now, this was a reasonable email I got from a DCAA auditor. This is an example of one that was a little bit weirder. We actually walked in to a accounting system audit several months ago, and a DCAA auditor said that all scanning systems had to be approved by DCMA. Now, DCMA, for those of you who don't know, is the Defense Contract Management Association, and they're actually who DCAA works for most of the time. The reality of the matter is that no such requirement exists. There is no such requirement for a DCAA approved scanning system, and we went through a series of emails. Well, and these were good auditors. We sort of ended up going through a series of emails where I sort of had to back them up against this and say, okay, either back up what you said or go on. All right, now here's the actual FAR section. If you see 1, 2, and 3 matches pretty closely to what the auditor sent me, only I think they used the word, what does it say, original, there's one term in here that was just sort of weird. Now, but the part she didn't put in there is an important section. It's the beginning of the section up here in the top C, where it says, nothing in this section shall be construed to preclude a contractor from duplicating or storing original records in electronic form unless they contain significant information not shown on the recorded copy. Okay? So that is the only section of the FAR and the DFARS. DFARS has something about scanning copies in terms of billing. And the word scan only appears in the DCAA contract audit manual as a meta tag up on the website, and in them attaching documentation to audit reports. So that one short section from the FAR, which will be on the handouts if you want to download it, I think it's about 4.7C, is actually the only thing in the FAR currently about it. Okay, so now what the FAR section and the first DCAA supervisor communicated, what I alluded to earlier. First, they've got to have a system in place. You just can't arbitrarily scan stuff. You've got to have a system in place that makes it work. And it's not enough to scan documents and toss the originals like in the commercial. You must put a system in place that provides both access and adequate accountability. Now, what I mean by access here is not auditor access. I'm talking about it's got to be a system that anybody who has to submit something can use pretty easily, or just get it going. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, one important thing to understand as we start doing these technology improvements is that there's really no direct correlation between improved technology and improved systems. This is a picture of one of the first adding machines made back in the 1880s, and I have one of them. It's not quite in that good a condition. During the 1890s, there was what was then the worst depression in American history. And one of the things that arose out of that depression was the creation of the certified public accountant profession. But there is a lot of academic studies that argue that one of the reasons why this depression of 1896 was so severe was because of the improved technology. That people were making the same mistakes they'd always made before the adding machine, they were just doing them quicker. And I think I've seen that often during my career, that we actually end up computerizing our mistakes and make our mistakes faster. One of the things that a lot of computer consultants or accounting computerized system consultants will tell you is you'll go to a client and they'll be paying you all this money for a new accounting system, and the first thing they'll ask you is to make it look like the old one. Okay? So there's a balance there that has to be struck in the real world. Okay, here's an illustration of it on the other side of the coin, though. Now, years ago, the banks pretty much stopped sorting canceled checks by check number. Some of you probably don't even remember when they used to do that. So then a lot of accounting departments started, when they got the canceled check in, would have somebody sit down for a while and sort them by check number and then file them away. So, and the idea was, well, we can find a check instantaneously then. Well, it's only like maybe once or twice a year back then that you had to pull out a canceled check. And even then, if you're only dealing with 1 month, it was actually pretty easy. So, if you had, a couple thousand checks a month, what are you doing, 2,000 some odd a year? It seemed to me didn't make a whole lot of sense. And we're going to talk about that back when we get to the originals. Of course, now we don't even get the checks. Okay, you got to make the technology work for you. It's got to balance against what the technology offers and what we actually need. Okay, all right, so the challenge then is to create an accounting system that balances the world issues of improved efficiency with accountability. All right, and then that system was, as it says in the FAR, and as it said in that email from the supervisor, that system has to be expressed in your policies and procedures. And we're going to talk about that. Now, there are several ways to approach creating a system like this, and we're going to deal with the various approaches for how you develop policies and procedures and get them going in the workshop in October. And right now, we're going to just walk through one example of a method here, okay? Now, in this case, we're probably going to start by what is our end product. What do we want out of a scanning system? What do we want? What does DCAA want? What does it have to do? Okay, the government requirements are that there has to be accurate images of the original records. There has to be an indexing system that allows you to identify. And we'll talk about whether that should be date, functional, or a combination of the two. The originals have to be maintained for a year. That is in the FAR. There's just no way around that. Okay. Now, what's our real world requirements? And when we think about it, what do we really want a scanning system to do? Well, we want it to be consistent. We don't want Joe scanning everything and Martha not scanning anything, unless Martha hands it over to somebody else and scans it. And we all know that that's a reality in a lot of business places. But we'll talk maybe about that in timesheets in a couple of weeks. But we would like, however the stuff gets done, we want to make sure that everything we identify that has to be scanned is scanned, and that the system sort of makes sense, that some things are scanned, some things aren't. Like if your Office Depot receipts or Staples receipts, if you're not scanning those, but you're scanning mill receipts, that you might want to think about that as being a little inconsistent. And we want it to be the easy use. Whatever system we adopt, we want it to be as easy to use as possible so that people will actually do it and that it'll be consistent and meet the other requirements. Okay, now documents are typically going to originate from two sources. And one of these is sort of arbitrarily named. Anybody thinks of a better name, please let me know. The first one is formal documents, because we're not just talking about scanning mill receipts. We're talking about possibly a scanning system where everything that goes in the accounting department or HR departments or other departments is either electronic to begin with or electronic at the end of it. So bank and credit card statements are a great example. We almost all get those electronically, and we should probably store them. I mean, some of the banks keep back 2 or 3 years online, but, it doesn't take a whole lot of hard drive space is cheap right now. You could probably keep your bank statements for as long as you want, or the credit card statements. Timesheets are another example. I had a case with a large contractor years ago. This is back in the late 90s, where all their timesheets, when they were entered into the accounting system using electronic timesheets, a Deltek product back then, they were all countersigned by the administrative assistant at this branch in Baltimore. None of them were signed originally by either the employee or she signed them all. And, so DCAA was going to disallow several $1 million in labor. And I was sitting there trying to find out, what to do about it. Fortunately, since I was a rather large contractor, they had actually taken the original timesheets and had them on microfilm and were able to produce those and get them to me. And sure enough, every single one of those had an original employee signature and a supervisor counter signature, even though that wasn't necessary. But that's an example of where scanning this stuff might be a great idea. Legal documents, leases, purchase orders, other vendor type orientated or HR type documents are a good candidate for scanning. All right, now then casual documents, which is not the term I'm completely comfortable with, but then we're talking about meals and entertainment receipts. We're talking about supplies, okay, and maybe fuel, other stuff like that. Just the stuff that sort of is not always planned out ahead of time, although sometimes it is. Okay, so regardless of where they originate from, either casual or formal, they need to follow similar processes. They need to be scanned unless they were originally electronic. They need to be delivered to the appropriate person. For example, if it's a travel voucher, it needs to probably go to AP, accounts payable, so you can get reimbursed. Or if it's an office supply or the credit card reconciled, most of the time we're talking about the accounting department, or it could be HR depending on how it's going. All right, so those are all in common. Then approval. There has to be, not only the receipt itself has to be approved as to all the other reasons for allowability, adequacy, etc., but also the quality of the actual scanned document itself. You have to be able to read it on the screen, at least, or read a paper printout of it so that it's usable and that you can identify it to be in accordance with the FAR. All right? Storage. We have to come up with methods. Eventually, these things have to be stored, both digitally and the original copies, at least for 1 year. All right, no matter what the hardware method is, whether it's a phone, tablet, scanner, you should try and get things into a couple of formats. PDF would be one, which may not be possible for us, or JPEG or system. And even then, they can be converted afterwards. Okay? Delivery falls into two areas, either the digital or the original. If it's digital, what I've set up with a lot of clients is what we call an email system. We set up an email address, such as travel@domain.com, whatever your domain is. And all of the receipts and the travel reports get emailed to that address. Now, that actually ends up being monitored by the accounts payable or the travel, whoever's in charge of approving travel expenses in the accounting department, not the supervisor who approves that. Then that gives you both the attachment as a digital copy in the mail system, in addition to the accounting people saving it, if everybody follows me on that. So you can do it both. That gives you sort of a double protection right there to make sure you've got everything. And it also means the person who sends it it's easier to keep a copy of it too, because they can just go back and see what they sent there. All right? Now the original, if you have to keep them for at least a year. So we're going to look at how they're going to be in some kind of folders and how that's going to be organized. One thing is just to do it by month. In other words, here's January, February, March, April 2013. Boom, we've got it a year. We're done. If there's only 50, 100 receipts in there, it'll be pretty easy to find the original if you need to. The other possibility is by functional expense. Now that probably would be tied to your chart of accounts or your project counts, or et cetera, and that might be an idea there, especially for the direct expenses. Then, or you could do a combination of both. You could do both and one functional expense. This goes back to the thing I said about the canceled checks earlier. If it's going to be if you're not going to have to dig into it very often, and if it's going to be fairly easy to find, then probably don't over-organize in it. Just doing it by month will probably be adequate. All right? Now, I alluded to this a little bit earlier. So with the digital thing, you've got the actual step. The accounts payable gets a expense reimbursement form in. They're going to check it on the usual accounting ways to make sure it was approved, make sure it's being coded right, make sure it's allowable, unallowable, etc. In addition, they're going to have to look at the scan copies and make sure they meet the standards, that they're legible, that any annotation is legible, that they're signed appropriately, and all the information that was on the original that you need to make the digital copy work is there. Same store issues on digital for the storage. I mean, you've got to find a way to store them where you can find them fairly easily and hopefully not lose anything. And then that goes into backup too, which is obviously a critical part of this, having a good backup plan. We'll talk about a little bit of this in this part of policy and procedures. Scanning does not require its own policy and procedure. I do not think you need to have a section of your policies and procedures that says, here's our scanning procedures. You can send some memos out to employees to tell them how to start. Now, having said that, everything we've talked about will be pretty much covered, should be covered in your policies and procedure, but it should be under the section for document control, which tells, who's responsible for keeping what do we keep, and how long we keep it, and where it's kept. That is a broader section of your policies and procedures, and there's an entire section of it, in my book, where the scanning is a subset of that. Okay. Then once again, we're done. I felt like I went on a little bit slower, but we can see it took us about 20 minutes to get everything done. Again, a lot of this is covered in the textbook, and a lot of this will be covered on the seminar in October. The handouts and access on YouTube to this webinar will be up in a little while this afternoon. I'll get it up. Now let's see if anybody has any questions. Send me questions. I have one question, which is, okay, if anyone can fake receipts, then how does DCAA know that they're real? Okay, that's a good question. We actually had a bunch of arguments with that, a bunch of other consultants and some DCAA auditors about this a while back on LinkedIn. And my argument, I used to tell students when I was describing the statement of cash flow to them, I said, show me the money. Here, show me the money. Now, that's ultimately how if you have a fake receipt for $200 and it never shows up on a credit card statement or a bank statement, then that's your first indication it's fake. If people are faking the credit card statement and the bank statement, then then the cash is not going to balance. Those things are treated like a reconciling item. Then they have to carry that fraud through all of the subsequent documents, or risk getting caught about it. And that becomes a little difficult to do. I'm not saying it can't be done. One of the other technology improvements that people say caused a lot of problems was the invention of loose leaf paper. How many people did not know that loose leaf paper was an accounting invention? Before that, you had to have books, these old leather-bound ledger books. And the first thing the auditor would do when they came in is look to see if any pages had been cut out. Once there were loose leaf pages, then it became a lot easier to fix the books, and the problems originated out of that. So that is pretty much what my answer to that is, and to a certain extent it's still a little bit problematic. If somebody really wanted to do that, they really could, and they deal with that all the time. Fortunately, it's easier to make money than it is to steal money in that kind of atmosphere, in my opinion. All right, let me check one more time, see if I have any other additional questions. And people can always email me at mail@dcaacompliance.com or savery@dcaacompliance.com if you have any additional questions. I had a couple of emails from the last webinar. The next one I'm going to try and make as interesting as I can. It's just sort of an outline of the contract audit manual the DCAA does and how that is supposed to interact with the FAR and how it is usually very abused. Now, in this case, we don't, because it's just flat out not mentioned in the contract audit manual. The DCAA auditors go back to the FAR. Where you get into trouble is when they sort of try and fit the square pegs in the round holes under the contract audit manual. And that's where we're going to talk about the dangers of that and how to deal with that and how to argue with it and how to take a little control of that situation. So hopefully I see all of you back here in 2 weeks. And if not, you all have a terrific day, and I will stop this now. Thank you.